My name is Will Rothschild, and I'm running for the State House of Representatives in District 32. And the reason I'm running is because I have two small daughters, and I care about this community, I care about their future, and I think that we need stronger leadership down in Columbia, and I think that we need people who are going to be more accountable to the people than the leaders that we've had.
If you're elected to the House, what would you change about the way the state raises and spends its money?
Well, I think that we need complete and total tax restructuring, tax reform in the state. And I'm not a tax expert, so I don't know what the proper mix ought to be between property taxes, income taxes, sales tax, and fees. But I know that what we have right now isn't working. And I think that what we need to have are some real experts who can come in and form a blue ribbon panel who can evaluate our state, the demographics of our state, the economics of our state, and come up with a completely new tax structure that's fair and equitable for everyone. What we don't need is another Band-Aid or more inequity disguised as tax reform like Act 388.
How do you feel about using public money to help parents pay for private school or homeschooling?
I'm not in favor of private school vouchers or a private school tax credit system. And for me, it's more practical than ideological. If I lived in a place like New York City or Boston or Chicago or Philadelphia, San Francisco, a larger urban area, tax credits or private school vouchers might make a lot of sense, because in those larger urban areas, in those cosmopolitan areas such as those, there are a lot of private school options. There's a lot more seats. And what's more, there's public transportation infrastructure in those types of cities that can get children from disadvantaged neighborhoods to the private schools. In South Carolina, we have neither one of those. Spartanburg is one of the larger urban areas in the state, and our private school options are fairly limited. There aren't that many seats. And what the private schools here, the product they sell, and they are selling a product, but this product they sell is the quality of the student body and the discipline of the student body. And I find it very hard to believe that they are going to jeopardize that by admitting dozens or even hundreds of students who are reading a grade level or two below the grade they're in. And so, what's more, even if they do admit a few of those students, how are those children going to get from their neighborhoods where they currently live to the private schools? There's no public transportation, and transportation is not a part of the equation of any private school voucher or tax credit system that I've seen. And so what I think would end up happening is that a private school voucher system or a tax credit system would be private school tuition reduction for folks who already send their children to those schools. And if that's the debate that we need to have about whether, if you send your children to private school, you should be able to opt out of paying a portion of your taxes that fund public education, then let's have that debate. And that's a debate I'm willing to have. But what the proponents of vouchers try to tell you is that they're worried about parent choice, and that they're worried about poor children, and that this is a cure-all for the ills that ail our public schools. And that's a disingenuous argument. It's not true, and that's not the way it would work.
What do you envision South Carolina being like in 20 years? And what are you going to do to make that vision a reality?
It's a great question. I think that it all goes back to education. I think that South Carolina has a wonderful opportunity to become a center of science and research. And I think some of the things that we've seen at Clemson University and some of the things we've seen with BMW and its chain of suppliers and how that's now starting to infiltrate into our higher education system in terms of the focus on science and technology is very exciting. It reminds me, I grew up in North Carolina, and it reminds me of some of the synergies that began to happen around their economy and their higher education system in the Research Triangle. And I think that's the model that we need to move toward. But to do that, we've got to come up with a mechanism for funding our K through 12 public education that's fair and equitable, and we've got to come up with a better system for funding our higher education system, because right now it's all over the board and there's no long-term vision. I also think that South Carolina has a chance to be a leader in energy technology. Right now we have no energy policy at all. We've got no alternative energy portfolio, unlike about 25 states across the nation who have moved to that. And the state that has really set the bar for that is, of all places, Texas. They've got the most aggressive alternative energy portfolio, and they're doing more with wind energy than any state in the country. And wind energy might not be the way to go in South Carolina. We probably don't have the wind that the vast plains of Texas have. But we need to get moving on some sort of energy policy in this state. So those are some of the things that I want to address in Columbia. But the most important thing I want to address down there is just bringing accountability and leadership back to Columbia. The two things that I want to address immediately, because I think whether you're talking about energy or you're talking about infrastructure or you're talking about tax policy or you're talking about education, the common thread in all of those is lack of leadership and a lack of accountability. And so two things I want to address immediately down there are I want to see every piece of legislation that has any spending attached to it ought to be a roll call vote. It's nearly impossible for the people of this state to know how their representative voted on legislation, because over something around 95% of the votes down there are voice votes. Yay or nay, the yays have it. And so everyone's got plausible deniability, and the people who elect these folks have no way of knowing how their person voted. And that's wrong. Now, I'm not saying we should go to a roll call vote on every vote, because that would slow things down incredibly, and it would junk up the process where it doesn't need to be junked up in some cases. But when it comes to spending people's money, it ought to be a roll call vote. You ought to know how your representative voted. And the other thing that we need to do is every earmark that comes down the pike needs to have a person's name attached to it. And I'm not one of these people who's against all earmarks all the time. Some earmarks might make a lot of sense, and especially if they can be proven that they'll have a direct benefit on economic development. But if the earmark makes sense, and it's something you believe in, you shouldn't have a problem putting your name on it. And so I think all earmarks ought to have a sponsor's name attached to it.